Clara Whitmore received no money, no house, no inheritance. At the reading of the will, she was handed only the keys to an abandoned cabin by Lake Champlain. No electricity, no running water, a place her family called the graveyard of lost memories. But on her first night there, Clara heard a whisper calling her name as the wind howled through the rotting wooden windows. Beneath the floorboards, she discovered a sealed stone cellar. On the lid of a box were the words, "You are the last one. The book isn't finished." If you believe some memories should never be forgotten, stay with us and follow Clara as she uncovers what comes next. Clara Whitmore sat in the last row of Burlington's town hall, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the worn wooden floor. She expected nothing, yet a small part of her still hoped. After all, she was the only daughter of Margaret Whitmore. Her mother had lived in Vermont, was withdrawn in a small apartment, and was writing things no one wanted to read. The lawyer's dry voice broke the silence. Clara's uncle, Ralph, inherited the colonial house on the hill. Her cousin Charlotte received several investment lots along Interstate 89. When Clara's name was called, the room fell quiet. Miss Clara Whitmore, the lawyer read, is granted full ownership of the property located at 16 North Bank Road, Lake Champlain. The accompanying note reads, "Do not sell. Only open when you're ready." A stifled laugh came from the right side of the room. "The cabin with no power and no water?" Charlotte whispered. "She left that to her?" "Fitting," Ralph muttered. "That place is full of dust, old books, and memories no one cares to keep." Clara didn't respond. She was used to it. She had once taught high school history in Boston, until her mother died in a late winter car crash on the icy roads. After that, she quit teaching, moved into a temporary apartment, and cut ties with most of her relatives. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the funeral, not out of anger, but exhaustion. Her mother used to communicate through small things, how she saved every handwritten letter from the 1940s, the old radio that still played war broadcasts every evening, the steady voice that told stories about those no one remembers. Clara had never had time for those stories, until her mother was gone. And now, all that was left to her was a decaying cabin. That afternoon, Clara drove her aging Subaru through melting snow and muddy roads. North Bank Road didn't appear on Google Maps, and her phone signal faded with every mile of dirt track. The cabin emerged at dusk, small, moss clinging to the roof, one window cracked. No one had lived there in at least 20 years. But when Clara turned the key, the door opened easily, as if it had never been locked. Inside, the air was cold and still. She swept her flashlight across the room, wooden walls, an old desk, a dusty cassette player. On the mantel sat a sealed envelope, red, wax still unbroken, addressed simply, "Clara, open only when you're alone." She picked it up. Her hand went numb with cold, and for the first time, she felt something waiting for her. Clara slit the envelope open with a small pocket knife. The paper inside carried her mother's familiar slanted handwriting. "This cabin isn't for living. It's where our family's story began and never truly ended. Under the floor." Clara swept her flashlight across the room. Beneath the frayed rug at the center was a floorboard of a different shade. She tapped it with the toe of her boot. Hollow. Kneeling, she pulled gently, revealing a small iron handle embedded in the wood. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled hard. The hatch lifted, and a cloud of dust rose like the breath of time long trapped. Beneath it was a narrow oak staircase descending into darkness. Clara switched on her flashlight, her pulse racing. The cellar was low-ceilinged, stone-walled, yet strangely dry. The air smelled of paper, leather, and rusted metal, the smell of an old library preserved underground. At the center stood a table draped with cloth, holding a large tin box and a thick leather-bound journal. Clara opened the box. Inside were letters, military ID cards, black and white photos of unnamed people, and one object that froze her. A brass American military badge engraved with the emblem of the OSS, the U.S. intelligence agency during World War II. When she lifted it, the metal felt ice cold. Stranger still, it vibrated slightly. It didn't glow or move, but she could swear she felt a faint heartbeat. Not her own. She set it down, exhaling slowly. She opened the journal. The first page bore strong handwriting, not her mother's. We don't need to be remembered. We just can't be forgotten. The next page showed a hand-drawn map. No borders, only locations. Champlain Crossing, Darby Line, Newport Tunnel. Clara recognized them as crossing points once used by the Underground Railroad, but these were dated in the 1940s. A note ran along the edge of the map. The road that once led slaves to freedom now carries those without a country. She turned the page and found a list of names, most crossed out, with notes beside them. Arrived in Vermont, 1944. Unrecorded. Clara froze. This wasn't just memorabilia. It was a hidden network, passed down in silence. And if the map was real, then the story wasn't over. Clara spent the next night photographing every page, every image, every scrap she found. She uploaded everything carefully into a new folder titled The Book of the Unnamed. The next morning, she posted a brief message on WWII History, a Reddit community for history enthusiasts. She didn't share photos, only a question. Has anyone ever heard of a Tabo escape network through Vermont? It seems similar to the Underground Railroad, but for European refugees. The post drew a few encouraging replies, but also skepticism. A user called Liberty, Monitor 1945, commented, "Sounds like a made-up story. There's no verified record of anything like that." Then, that night, she received a private message. "Stop digging. You have no idea what you're opening." No name, no profile picture, just one empty message, enough to chill her to the bone. She tried to ignore it, but when she looked back at the map, her eyes stopped on a red X beside the words Sugar Line Refinery. A handwritten note read, "Hid 3 people, night of Deck 17, 1943. Clara found the name. An old sugar refinery, abandoned since the 1980s near Darby Line, less than 2 miles from the Canadian border. The next day, she drove there. The snow had melted into slush, and the rusted smokestacks rose like the spine of some long-dead beast. She spotted an unevenly placed rectangular slab of stone near a collapsed wall. Beneath it was a small tin box, wrapped in a moldy oilcloth. She took it back to the cabin. Inside, a black-and-white photo of an American soldier holding hands with 3 children, 1 boy, 2 girls, standing in the woods. Their faces were blurred, but written in pencil on the back was 17/12/1943, brought across to Canada via rail. There was also a thin envelope sealed with red wax, dated 1944, OSS internal, do not file. Clara hadn't even opened it when her phone rang. It was Uncle Ralph. "Clara, I heard you've been posting things online?" She said nothing. "Listen," he continued. "I was just contacted by a group of investors from New York. They want to buy the entire cabin property to develop an eco-resort. But if you turn it into some fake memory center or whatever this is, the whole thing goes to hell." "I'm not planning to sell," Clara said. You may not have a choice. The estate's still tied up in probate court. The longer you hang on to that place, the worse it'll be for you." The call ended. Clara sat motionless for a long time. She looked at the OSS badge on her desk. Someone was trying to bury something. And maybe she'd already gotten too close. Clara returned to the cabin late that night, her mind racing. The anonymous message, the pressure from Uncle Ralph, the clues she'd uncovered. Everything was tightening into a web far bigger than she had imagined. She opened the tin box again, this time with care. The envelope labeled OSS Internal had been typed on a manual typewriter, marked with red ink in the corner. Most of it had faded, but one section was still legible. Agent EM confirmed to have violated withdrawal orders, escorted a group of civilians across the Vermont-Canada border on Deck 17, 1943. No formal documentation, no name filed, internal case closed. Clara stared at the initials. EM, a memory surfaced. Her mother's necklace, the one with the brass ship's wheel pendant. She'd worn it for 30 years, until the day she died. Clara had never asked where it came from. The next day, she returned to an old train station foundation near Newport, one of the marked spots on the map. As she wandered, unsure of the direction, she encountered an older man wearing a knit cap with the VFW insignia. He stood quietly, studying her for a moment, then said softly, "You're on the right track." Before she could respond, he turned and slowly disappeared down a forest trail, vanishing behind the pines. Where he had stood, Clara noticed an old iron rail marker. She dug near it with a small trowel and found a wooden box, edges frayed with age and oilcloth peeling. Inside was a photograph of 3 children standing beside a young woman, Clara's grandmother. On the back, written in slanted script, "Got all 3 safely to Vermont. No papers, no country. Network still active." Clara's hands trembled. She sat on the cold concrete floor, staring at the photos, the papers, the names, the coded signs. Her mother, her grandmother. They had both been part of a hidden network, not for recognition, but to preserve the truth for those no one remembered. She returned to the cabin in silence, reopened her drive folder, and changed the title. The Book of the Unnamed, a living record for those history forgot. That night, Clara recorded her first voice note. Her voice was quiet but clear. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm not a historian. I'm just the granddaughter of a woman who once saved someone else. And I think their story deserves to be told." For the first time, she didn't feel alone. Clara started sleeping at the public library in Montpellier, where she'd been granted a temporary workstation. The cabin was no longer safe, and after the threatening message, she knew someone was watching her. 3 days later, when she returned to check the cellar archive, she knew something was wrong when she stepped inside. The wooden door was still locked, but muddy footprints stretched from the front entry to the hearth. Clara flipped on her flashlight. Her pulse spiked. She opened the cellar hatch. What she found below, she would never forget. The bookshelf had collapsed. The tin box was wide open, and documents were scattered across the dirt floor. Photos were torn in half. Several letters were missing. Map pages were crumpled. The leather journal her mother had left behind. Its cover was gone. On the desk, someone had scrawled in thick black ink, "Last warning." Her hands trembled, but it didn't stop there. A clear set of muddy boot prints led in and out at the foot of the stairs, where dust had once sat untouched. Fresh, someone had been here, and left not long before she arrived. Clara stood frozen, throat tight with dread. As she sifted through the wreckage, she spotted a half-burned photo beneath the desk. A young soldier, wearing the same OSS badge she had once held. Half the picture had been destroyed. She sank to the floor, breath catching in her chest. And for the first time, she asked herself, "Am I doing the right thing?" That night, Clara received an email from the estate's legal representative. The cabin was now officially being reviewed under a probate court dispute. Her continued misuse of property for unverifiable historical claims could result in temporary forfeiture of her rights. One line made her blood run cold. "We strongly advise Miss Whitmore to refrain from distributing unverified materials any further." Clara stared at the screen, and for the first time, she wanted to quit. In the quiet library, Clara closed her laptop, turned off the lights, and sat alone with the worn, leather-bound journal, the only one left from the cellar. As she flipped to the final page, a small paper slipped from the spine, a yellowed envelope carefully tucked between two pages, as if her mother had placed it there long ago. On the front, in her mother's familiar slanted handwriting, it read, "Open only if everything feels like it's falling apart." Clara stared at the words. She knew. She was already there. Clara sat still for a long time before opening the envelope. The paper inside was thin, browned at the edges, folded in thirds. Inside was a short handwritten letter and an old birth certificate, one name blacked out with red ink. At the top, stamped in block letters, "Redacted." Her mother's voice filled the page. "Clara, if you found this, then you're closer than I ever got. You always asked who your father was. I never answered. Not because you didn't deserve to know, but because he wasn't allowed to exist on paper. Your father was Elias Moore, an OSS officer during the war, assigned to gather intelligence in northern France in 1944, but he broke orders. Instead of retreating, he led a group of children and a nurse across the forest into Switzerland. Afterward, he vanished from all official military records. They didn't want him to become a symbol, a man who chose morality over command. He came to Vermont in 1946, lived under a false name, and he loved your mother. You are the result of a man erased to keep the war's story clean." Clara sat frozen. She thought of everything. The ship's wheel necklace her mother had worn for decades, the half-burned photograph of the soldier, the OSS badge, the memo marked, "Do not file." It all fit, but in a completely new order. She wasn't just preserving someone else's story. She was the next chapter. Clara opened her laptop. The folder, The Book of the Unnamed, still glowed on the screen, waiting. She created a new website with a simple domain, www.thekeeperremains.org. She began uploading photos, maps, recordings, and every handwritten page her mother had left behind. Then she wrote her first blog post. "Elias Moore was never listed, but he existed, and I am the proof. He didn't just save lives, he gave me something more powerful than truth, a reason to keep telling it. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I'm not afraid anymore." When she hit publish, there were no fireworks, no music, just a blank screen, now carrying a voice. 2 days after Clara published the story of Elias Moore, her inbox exploded. An email arrived from Smithsonian Magazine's subject line, "Your father's story deserves to be told." They wanted to feature her full article in their online history section, along with an interview, archival verification, and help accessing federal records. Within a week, the story spread. The Atlantic reposted an excerpt under the headline, "The OSS Ghost," The American soldier history erased, and the daughter who found him. The next day, the Vermont VFW chapter released an official statement. We recognize Elias Moore as one of our own. Though his name never made the files, his actions saved lives and left behind a living witness, Clara Whitmore. Clara didn't cry. She just sat quietly for a long time, then opened her laptop and wrote a short email to Uncle Ralph and the rest of the family. No accusations, no demands, just a single link to the website and one simple line. This is why I didn't sell the cabin. The family gathered with their lawyer a week later to discuss continuing the property dispute. When the meeting ended, Uncle Ralph lingered behind. Clara, he said, hesitant, I didn't know. About your dad. She looked at him but said nothing. She didn't have to. With the truth now public, they wouldn't be filing another claim. Clara formally registered the cabin as a nonprofit community archive under the sponsorship of the Vermont Historical Society. Its official name, The Keeper Remains, a living history cabin. She opened the doors every weekend. People came from all over. A college student brought her grandfather's war journal. An elderly couple handed over a photograph of a soldier who never came home. An 11-year-old boy placed a drawing on her desk and said, "This is my grandpa. He saved people too." Clara taped the drawing next to her mother's old desk. Then she placed a small wooden sign in front of the stone cellar. This path doesn't lead to the past. It leads to the stories that were never told. When night fell over Lake Champlain, the cabin still glowed, not from the fireplace or ceiling lights, but from the stories that had been lit, one page at a time. Every Saturday morning, Clara Whitmore hung a small wooden sign outside the cabin. Memory Garden Project, share yours. No ceremony, no sign-up sheet. Anyone could sit. Anyone could speak, or just listen. The cabin now had folding chairs, a writing table, a document scanner, and a wooden box in front of the cellar door. Leave what wasn't told. A Vietnam War veteran once came by, holding a frayed leather notebook. He didn't say much, just placed it gently on the table and nodded. Inside were poems written in pencil from 1969. The following week, a young woman from Montreal brought a cassette tape. Her grandmother's voice on the recording recounted how she escaped across the Vermont woods in 1942, thin, trembling, but still laughing between breaths. After listening, Clara wrote just one line in her journal. This was never just my story, and it never should have been. One crisp autumn day, she received an email from an unfamiliar address, Moore Elias, 1946gmail.com. It was from a 26-year-old man living in Quebec. Part of the message read, "I grew up wondering about my great-grandfather. My mom told me he saved people, then vanished. When I read what you shared, I cried. Thank you for bringing him back and giving our whole family a name." Clara replied with just one sentence. "This story is yours too. Keep writing it." She printed the email, laminated it, and pinned it to the cellar entrance, right next to the photo of her father, Elias Moore. One quiet evening, Clara sat alone, a new journal open in her lap. Lake Champlain was still as glass outside the window, reflecting a burning red sky. She wrote the first line, "I'm not the last. I'm just the first one who dared to open the hatch." Then she looked into the small camera on her desk and recorded a simple message. No music, no editing. If you're holding a memory you think no one wants to hear, I'm here, and I'm listening. If you believe some stories shouldn't be forgotten, share them. Please send them to the project, or just tell a friend. Because every memory, no matter how small, is worth keeping.